What do you think are the biggest issues facing the school system right now?
Education has not been high on the agenda of this government for a decade. And all of the things that we're seeing, the pandemic has emphasised a lot of the lack of investment, the lack of attention, the lack of a priority. So we don't have any stability in the Department for Education. We've had, 10 education ministers in the last 12 years. We've had 4 in the last 5 months. I mean, if you were running a business like this, it'd be a completely failed business. I'm just going to emphasise here for the rest of the whole programme, bearing in mind what we just had from Anthony Slaughter, I'm mainly going to talk about England and education and really emphasise that education in Wales is not run in the same way here. So I just want to emphasise that before I get into any trouble about talking about as if I'm talking about Wales as well. So I think instability and a lack of priority from this government when we've seen the education ministers come and go. And this has resulted in people taking their eye off the ball when it comes to funding. And I don't just mean funding for teachers or funding for schools. There's a whole combination of a lack of investment in education at all, or paying any attention to funding. So there's suddenly another resurgence of the school cuts campaign, and that was relaunched, I think, last week. And we're talking about there is a billion pounds of school cuts to 90% of schools in England are losing money in terms of income, and they're expected to be able to fund extra wages, extra courses, and to recover from the pandemic. So school funding is a major issue, and that links into the pandemic. So after the pandemic, with schools and young people were promised extra support, extra funding to catch up. So certainly to be able to have some more one-to-one or targeted support, particularly for students in less advantaged areas or who hadn't had computers and are much more disadvantaged because of that during the pandemic. And that has not reached down to the people who need it. At lunchtime, I was having a chat with a young person, a young green, who is a teaching assistant, but has a lot of responsibility in their school. And they were saying that the schools are going to have to patch up this. I think every 6 weeks, they're going to focus on a particular child, then another 6 weeks, another 6 weeks, just so they can catch up with their age-related learning. So lack of focus, lack of funding, lack of being able to combat the issues of the pandemic. I mean, it's all reactive. It's all reactive because there hasn't been any forward thinking or leadership from a government point of view. So I think it's systemic with the fact that this government really don't care about state education.
So you talked about a lot of things there, and I want to pick up a couple of them before we talk about the industrial disputes. And I guess you talked there about funding as being a crucial element of this, and the kind of wave of cuts we've seen since 2010 and the austerity years. But one of the planks of the government's education reforms that came in during the coalition under David Cameron was academisation and the privatisation of parts of our education system through free schools. What role do you think those have played in the undermining of state education?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fragmenting of the education system, which has been the lasting legacy, I think, with this government. I mean, this government are on their way out. I cannot see how this government could barely survive another 2 months, never mind another 2 years. Certainly, whichever government comes after this, whether it's a Conservative or a Labour government, have got a hugely fragmented system. And by that, I mean, you have academies, you have free schools, you have studio schools, you have federations, you have some state local authority run schools. And this actually, and the Department of Education is realising this, they don't have control over this fragmented system. So when it comes to the pandemic, for instance, and when the unions and parents stood together in January 2021 and said, we cannot reopen these schools safely, the whole lack of structure within the education system meant that it actually had empowered teachers and local areas in that regard, but it certainly doesn't empower the government. the fragmentation is meant to be to divide and rule and mean that certain local areas have got much less control in their local councils. It also means that there is confusion for parents over who's responsible for the education, especially special educational needs education, because that still comes underneath the local authority, and yet it's having to be dealt with in a fragmented system. Unfortunately, the Labour Party and the Labour Shadow Secretary of State for Education and the whole team are not talking about addressing this issue at all. They're only interested in education in terms of the classroom, not in terms of structures. But it's the structural deficit that we've seen in the last 10 years, which is meaning that reform and progression and making changes is much more difficult to do in a top-down way. So I really push the Labour Party to look again at the way in which we have private companies, hugely inflated salaries involved in our education, because we're still, as a taxpayer, paying for this education, but it's not going towards what we would consider and what parents consider a local authority council driven approach.
So one of the big issues taking place in the education system right now is that we have three major unions in the school sector: the NEU, the NASUWT, and the NAHT, in the process of balloting for strike action. What are the key issues underlying that dispute?
Well, I mean, when we go to strike action as teachers, there's lots of things we would like to strike over in terms of curriculum and fragmentation educational system, but one of the only things that people can legally strike over are pay and conditions. So pay and conditions is really driving this. And you've mentioned the NEU, or what some people think of as the NUT, the old National Union of Teachers, but the National Education Union is looking at the whole of the education sector, including support staff, including sixth form teachers, including all educators. But it's not just that union. It is the NASUWT and the National Association of Headteachers who are balloting for strike action. All of these ballots due in by the beginning of January. And when you read the National Association of Headteachers, they are having meetings for their members with their senior union leaders all over the country. I think I saw Southampton, which is the closest to me in the Isle of Wight, Newcastle, all over are hosting meetings in November, December, looking at this. Because it's 10 years again of a lack of rise in educators' wages. And the NASUWT have calculated that that's costing your average classroom teacher £50,000 a failure to keep up with inflation. They would have been given as wages and earned an extra £50,000, and that's been taken from them. So this has radicalised even those middle of the road teaching unions like the NASUWT on that. And the third thing is that the rises that the government in the Strategic Review Pay Board have put forward, the wage rises of 5%, which doesn't keep in line with inflation, and teachers are affected by the cost of living. Certainly all educators are, and certainly supply staff are leaving being supply staff, and support staff are leaving being support staff, because the wages which they're being offered are not going to be able to let them afford the rising cost of living. But all of that is, again, down to 10 years of a failure to invest, 10 years to keep up with those pay rises, pensions as well. But all of this money is being expected to be taken out of school budgets. So when teachers are being awarded pay rises by the government, that money is not fully funded. So the NASUWT and the National Education Union and the NAHT are all campaigning for fully funded pay rises. Because as a teacher, I don't want any pay rise that I deserve to be taken out of the budget for my school. I'm already printing work for worksheets and stuff in my own house, in my own time. I'm already using my own money to be able to supplement stuff that our school can't provide. So certainly I do not want any wage rise to come out of the school budget, because that is a complete lack of long-term foresight vision on what we need to do to invest in our kids.
So your last point there leads me really nicely onto one of the questions that's come through in the chat, which I'm going to move on to a question from the chat now. If you haven't already, please do stick your questions in the chat for Vix, and we'll try and read out as many of them as possible. So Rich Turner has asked, and it relates to that last point around the demand for a pay rise. So Rich Turner asks, what are the prospects for a sustained campaign on teachers' pay, given that both the government and Labour are blanking on the whole issue of public sector pay more broadly?
Yeah, and this is why the unions, particularly in education, come into their own element. The unions again showed in January 2021, the unions got together, especially the NEU, and tried to protect, which is their job, to protect their members and the safety of their members during the COVID crisis. And whilst the government and the Labour Party are failing to speak out about the cost of living crisis when it comes to education, it's the unions who are. And I don't just mean militant unions, people that would normally strike. The NASUWT have not balloted for strike action for their members since 2011. So the last time they did this was very, very early days of the coalition government. So being a union member is the only way at the moment, in the way in which Westminster government and Westminster is made up of MPs from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, is the unions are going to show that they will not stand for or accept this. And I'm sure that parents will understand that in the same way that they are needing rise of the cost of living for their wages, that teachers also need that. So it's a really strong case for being a member of a union, certainly in the education sector.
I'm going to move on to a very different topic now, but still within the education sphere, because I've got another great set of questions in the chat, if that's okay. So Philip Davis has asked, what do you think the Green Party should be doing to promote the teaching of politics within schools?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, we teach A-level politics where I am, but the A-level politics curriculum is not what I would consider political literacy. And I think it's political literacy, which young people need to be much more aware of as citizens of the future. And I don't just mean at secondary schools. There's certainly opportunities for political literacy at primary schools as well. And by that, I mean not just about what we get on the television when it comes to general elections, but local government, local politics, campaigning. I heard the political thinking interview with Carla Denyer yesterday with Nick Robinson on Radio 4. And in that, she was being asked about her route to being a active campaigning citizen and a political leader. And she talked about being at school and campaigning on issues which we wouldn't consider to be party political. She's talking about, fair trade, food in their canteen. And to be able to empower young people with the knowledge of how to campaign, how to be an assertive citizen, this stuff is taught in the private sector. This stuff is taught in private schools about how to be articulate, how to be able to argue their point politely. And that's what I would consider to be political literacy, to be an active citizen, rather than just a dry academic curriculum. So we used to have those citizenship lessons. We used to have citizenship being a central point. We now see schools talking about social, moral, spiritual, cultural education. But I think political with a small p should really be added onto that as a citizen, because we start to see bigger problems further down the line when young adults don't have that political literacy. They just step away from politic engagement altogether. So I know the Young Greens have done brilliant work in doing political literacy sessions. And I think that all young people deserve to have that stuff at school rather than just our wonderful political party and the Young Greens.
Yeah, thank you. So, what looks like it might be our final question is from Meg S. Foster. And Meg asks, what education policies from the Green Party's global sister parties would you love to see implemented in the UK?
Oh wow, global sister parties in terms of Scotland, Wales, or all over. Yeah, that's a really difficult question, Meg. Thanks, because I need to be aware of all the policies from all the global parties. I mean, when it comes to education, it is really important to look internationally. I know we quite often refer to Finland. I know that the NEU General Secretaries have been over to Cuba. There is so much stuff that we can learn internationally. I think one thing that sticks out for me would be starting age for education. Our starting age for education about 4 years, and the emphasis on nursery education, teaching formal reading and formal lessons is far too young. So I think the emphasis on early years being a foundational part, I think looking at moving much more in line with a continental Northern European starting age for school or formal school from the age of 6 or more, I think is really fundamental. Trying to explain to the electorate here why that is not a cop-out. But the younger that you start formal education, there is no linkage between the higher results that you get at the age of 16 or even 11 years old. So I think that would be a game changer when it comes to young people and mental health in young people as well. Learn through play rather than through formal lessons.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Vix. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always. A friend of Bright Green, Vix Lowthion, thank you so much.